Okay guys, welcome to a new opening video. This time we'll look at the Italian game, mainly for white, but there will be some tips and some tricks for black as well. We'll take a look at some topical lines and some not so topical lines that were previously played a lot on the top level, but now the computer, of course, the supercomputers have made some improvements and made some line redundant. We'll take a look at those as well. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop C4. This is the Italian game. You could also start with, of course, bishop C4 here. This is the bishop's opening, but it will probably lead to slightly different positions because very often white delays playing knight F3 and instead plays D3, knight C3, and often tries to get F4 in. So it's a sort of hybrid between the bishop's opening and the Vienna game. Okay, so bishop c4, knight f6 is my starter move here for black. There are, of course, many options for black in this position. The two main options are bishop c5 and the aforementioned knight f6, but you can also go d6, bishop e7, even h6 has been played. I'll take a look at knight f6 first, and then some minor details in the bishop c5 line, because very often these will transpose. Knight f6 does allow one line that bishop c5 doesn't, and that's the fried liver attack. You could go for the sensible d5 main line here. You could also play bishop c5, a very dangerous gambit. Probably as dangerous or even more dangerous for black than for white, but it's a cool weapon to use in a practical game, and if your opponent is not really prepared, then this could give you a lot of fun. But be aware that this line is not recommended, and it's probably not fully sound, but it's fun. D5 is, of course, the way to go and play like this, but this is not the topic of this video. Probably another video at some later stage, but a cool line nevertheless to know, and it's useful to know that knight f6 does allow the fried liver if your opponent is up for it. Bishop c5 does not allow it, because then we have the queen covering this g5 square. So okay, knight f6. Now there are some different options for white here. You could of course go for the fried liver, but you could also go for d3, c3, or maybe even d4. You can also castle, of course. This is probably one of the main moves. D3 is going to be the topic of this video, just covering the pawn. And of course now bishop c5. So very often these lines will transpose. I'm not going to take a look at bishop e7, d6 lines, even though playing bishop e7 and going for stuff like this has been quite popular recently, at least lines involving h6, g5, gaining some space on the king side. This is not a classical way to play though, it's very modern, but not the topic of this video. So bishop c5, gaining some central control and developing another piece, so everything's good for black so far. And now white does have a variety of options, and this is quite typical for the Italian game. There are many transpositions, many nuances and details, and slightly different variations, but I'm just gonna attempt to give you a sort of overview of some of the key ideas to know for white and for black in this opening, and the theory and the nuances you can check yourself if you are really interested. But playing this opening at a reasonably high level does not really demand a whole lot of theory. You can play this at a strong club level without knowing very many specific lines. So bishop c5, one of the main plans for white in this opening is c3, d4, gaining space in the center, and therefore c3 is a very natural way to start. But let's take a look at castles first. This leads us to a slightly more quiet but very traditional way of playing the Italian game, d6. And of course now c3 can be played yet again. a6 is a very nice move to know with black. You could also go for something like a5, which has been quite topical recently, but a6 is the classical way to play, just to give your bishop a safe haven on a7, and of course to control this b5 square. Bishop b3 is a key move for white, and you might wonder why, because why do you move the bishop yet again and to b3, which looks like a slightly more passive square? Well, the answer is this a6 move. It doesn't just give black the opportunity to play bishop a7, but also it controls an important square here on b5. So black could castle, and we could play something like this. Knight a5, and of course in this position bishop b3 would just give up the bishop here, and this bishop is very important in both the Ruy Lopez and the Italian game. Very important as it controls many light squares in the center, and eyes f7, so you want to keep this bishop. In this position, bishop b5, and getting the bishop to c2 is quite typical. And now of course bishop b6 to avoid the fork with b4, and probably c5 will be played by black, but now we have landed in a sort of closed Ruy Lopez type of variation, which the Italian game often can transpose to. But this shows why it's important to keep an eye out for this bishop on c4. So now you have to play bishop b3, because let's say rook e1, knight a5 would leave us no choice but to give up the bishop for the knight, which is not a total crisis, but it's not really the most ambitious way to play, and giving up the bishop here so early is not recommendable. So bishop b3, recommended by many authors and top players for many years. Bishop a7, knight b to d2, which looks quite passive. So after castles, what's white's main plan here? I mean, you might remember that I wanted to play d4 with white, and it looks like a long way off now. So my main plan is to play the knight around to g3 to regroup a bit, get the rook into the central square of e1, and then once everything's in place, I'm gonna play d4 and start to control the center of the board. So first I play h3, because after rook e1, then knight g4 could be a slight nuisance, because this f2 square is weak. Let's just avoid this. h3, very useful. And I mentioned this plan for white, hopping around with the knight to g3. This is also black's main plan in this position, regrouping the knight from c6, where it doesn't really do much, to g6, where it can contribute to maybe an initiative on the king sides, or at least be slightly more active and still support the e5 pawn. So this is black's next move as well. Knight e7, rook e1, just preparing this regrouping maneuver. And as you can see, the play in the Italian game is more closed and requires patient play. So it's very it's a very let's say positional and strategic opening, whilst the Sicilian often can be more open and more attacking minded from very early on. Of course, Sicilian defense can be very unbalanced and strategic and positional as well, but very often Italian game and e4 e5 is very different from openings such as the Sicilian defense, or maybe even the French defense, Caro-Kann and so forth. Knight g6, knight f1. Now c6 could be played to control the center even more. Rook e1 could be played, and then d5 eventually. But first, h6 is a key move for black, because very often black wants to play knight h5 just to control this g3 square, to avoid and stop white from playing knight g3 himself. So prophylaxis, and then continue with queen f6 and get one of these knights into f4 and start a sort of attack. And this can be quite dangerous, but in this position white does have bishop g5, so f6 is not possible because of the pin, of course. So we have to move the queen somewhere. So let's say queen e8. Now I've marked two of white's main options. So first of all, we have stopped the queen coming to f6. That's very good, but if we are not careful, then h6 can just kick the bishop and the queen can come around to f6 again. So we have to be a bit careful here. We have to think thoroughly about our next move. So d4 is a fine move, just to get some space in the center, and then maybe retreat with the bishop to e3. Looks perfectly viable and makes a lot of sense. But we also have a tactical opportunity here with knight takes e5. So queen takes h5, looks good. And remember that h6 is not a good move here, because we can take on g6 and we will have a full pawn up after queen takes g5, and we have an exchange, and white is a pawn up and will probably be a lot better in the endgame. So knight f4 is a better move. And now there are not many moves for white. I mean, if you move the queen to h4, then black can just take on d3, and this will be suddenly tables have turned and black will be better. So d4 is the only move basically that can give white an advantage, or even equal play. We take on h5 and there will be an exchange on e5. Black will win back the pawn. But now after knight e3, we see that the knight is eyeing two very juicy squares on d5 and f5. And if the white knight reaches any of those squares, then black will struggle to equalize. And a move like c6 will be very weakening for black, especially since the knight on h5 is currently a bit offside as well. So black's best move is probably to take on e3. We will take back with our bishop, and we will be slightly better for a long time with white here, because we have two bishops, the bishop pair, and very nice control over the center of the board. We can play rook d1, and probably there will be some exchanges. Maybe we will exchange one pair of rooks, but not both rooks. And we will try to use our small advantage with the two bishops to win the game. But this is slightly better for white, but certainly no fun for black. So this is a great success if you get this with white. Okay, so that was just a small detour basically, because castles is not the main move. c3 is probably the main move. We can have a look at another, I'm not going to say offbeat variation, but I've met this myself actually against an international master in classical chess. Knight c3 is a tricky move. d6 is very sensible. You could of course play something like h6 as well, just to stop white from playing his main plan, bishop g5. Then black will be faced by this move, bishop e3, and if you take, then of course white will have an open f-file, and white is trying to attack a lot in this variation. It's been played by very attacking-minded players earlier. Daniil Dubov, for example, has played this against Rajabov in 2019. The game ended in a draw, but white has definitely chances in this variation. So d6, bishop g5. It's my recommended move for white here. And now you might wonder what's the plan for white. I mean, we rarely want to exchange the bishop pair for nothing. But in this case, we get a perfectly placed knight on d5. Black must retreat to cover c7. And then we play the key move c3. So we have two plans in this position. We can, of course, as I've marked with my arrows here, gain some space on the queen side. Or we can play d4. And kick the bishop away from c5 and get some space in the center. So this knight is really doing a tremendous job, and black can't really live with this knight for too long. So knight e7 is a very common move to challenge this knight. And of course we can retreat to e3 and then kick the bishop away. We can also play d4. Which is a very sharp move played by Pentala Harikrishna on several occasions with success. He did beat Anish Giri in 2014 in this variation, so it's not without sting or venom in any way. Knight takes d5 has been played a lot. I'm just going to give you a sample variation to show how dangerous this variation can be in a practical game. dc5, knight f4 looks very active, but actually it runs into some very devious play from white. g3, knight h3, stopping short castle, and adding some pressure on f2, but that's of course no worry for us because we were planning to castle queenside anyway. If bishop d7, then we can add some pressure on this pawn, by, for example, putting our queen on b4 or a3. And king f8 is met by the genius move long castles. So we threaten knight e5 amongst other things, and we allow knight f2 with a fork. Rook d f1. This is a variation you need to know before playing it in a practical game, because if you don't know this with black especially, then you will have problems. I can guarantee you. And this is much easier to play with white without any major preparation. Of course, it's risky, but this is actually objectively good for white. So if black goes full on with knight h1, then he will basically lose, I think, at least be in major trouble after knight h4. You can postpone the inevitable with a check on g5, but after chucking our king away in the corner, then the black king will be under tremendous fire from the white pieces. So this is very bad news for black. You can play queen b6 to cover the knight. Another genius move from white, cutting away the queen, knight d4. And after takes, rook takes f2, we have a threat of rook takes f7. f6 is the only move, and now a devious move. Another one from white, bishop b3, just threatening queen c4 with all sorts of threats, mate on f7 among others. And after covering this, for example, with king e7 trying to run away, we can even take back on d4 if we want, or just add insert queen c4, and white will be better in this position. Black will struggle with his king's safety, and we will have a better pawn structure with white as well. So this is quite promising. If you get this sort of preparation in a practical game, your opponent will be blown off the board, I think. But I'm just gonna present a small disclaimer here, guys. Knight c3 doesn't really win for white. It's a fun move, but it's fully playable for black as well. So c3 is probably the best move in the position, at least the most common. d6, castles, and we have this typical play, and I'm gonna show you a5. We looked at a6 previously. a5 is also worth checking. Gaining some space on the queen side, whilst of course providing a safe haven for the bishop. h3 is following the same plan with white here, but now we have a slightly different approach from black, because now with a5 played, bishop e6 is also a move, which of course was a move that you could have considered earlier with a6, but it makes even more sense now with a5 played, because now we have gained some extra space on the queen side as well. So there's a definitely smaller chance that white will get some initiative with b4. Bishop takes e6 is not something black should fear, because we take back with the pawn, and yes, we have a double pawn, and you might learn early that this is not good. This is static and might become weak, but this pawn is very difficult to attack. You could play queen b3, but then just queen d7 protects everything, and queen b7 of course runs into a well, slightly concerning move, I would say, rook b8, and this will be quite embarrassing for white. So this is not really dangerous, and this pawn also covers important central squares on f5 and d5, whilst of course opening the f-file for the rook. So all good for black here, just a lot of advantages and no disadvantage in getting a double pawn here. So white often tries to sidestep this with bishop b5. Now we have a very interesting move with black. This is one of my favorite moves in the position and in the entire variation, queen b8. Just going for queen a7 to put some pressure on f2, but also control the d4 square, which is very important. So in the Nimzo Indian, we have the e4 square, which is often very important, and the Italian game, the d4 square is the equivalent. Super important to control. And in this position, b3 has been played, but I would recommend a4, just getting total control over this b5 square and the white squares on the queen side. And of course black can continue with queen a7, and we have a sort of Mexican standoff in the center here. No one can really move and do anything, but it's a lot of play that's left in the position. So this is definitely quite interesting. You can go for knight c4, and then of course exchange off the bishops. You can go bishop g5. I mean, there's so many options. White will still try to get d4 in, whilst black will attempt to go for d4, d5 and break in the center before white can play d4. So a lot of options, a very rich variation in the Italian game. Instead of a4, you can also consider slightly changing the pawn structure with bishop takes c6. Then of course you will have d4, and then after bishop b6, queen c2, and I'm not going to say white has an advantage here, but it's a very different pawn structure, quite similar to the Berlin actually, the d3 variation against Berlin, which is at least something a bit different from the usual stuff, so you can consider this as well. So these variations are quite interesting, I would say, and it gives you a very good intro to the knight f6 against the Italian game. Short peek into the bishop c5 variations. I'm not going to look into those that transpose into the knight f6 stuff. As I mentioned earlier, you avoid the fried liver with bishop c5, so this could be one big argument to play this. But it does allow some variations as well, so it's not really without its flaws. c3, knight f6 is a very common follow-up, but now d4, because we were not in time to add pressure to the e4 pawn, so white can ignore this and play d4 instead. ed, cd, and now I would really recommend checking, adding a check on b4 with the bishop b6, or any other passive move would allow e5, and now white is just a lot better, and will probably win. So you can play something like d5 of course, but after ef, dc, d5, this is terrible. The desired retreat knight e7 is not possible because there's the pawn on f6, so you have to go for knight b4. Looks like this actually loses a piece, drops a piece after queen a4 with a check and also a threat on the knight, but c6 is a very nice move. You can't take on b4 because, ouch, bishop a5 wins the queen, but white can just castle and enjoy a tremendous attack against the black king. So this is not recommended for black at all. You should know your stuff and you should play bishop b4 check. Very shortly I'm going to give you a slight tour of the very quick tour of the old knight c3 gambit variation. This is not so common anymore. Knight e4 is of course the way to pick up the gauntlet and accept the gambit. Castles. And now there are some different moves black can play. I'm gonna take a look at both captures. Knight takes c3 is not the best, but very tempting. bc, and now d5 is the best move, which will probably equalize for black after moves like this, for example. Knight d7, queen a4, bishop d7, b5, threatening bishop a3, so there's no time to win a pawn with a6 here. You have to castle, and after queen c4 I think it's very much equal. White will play bishop a3 or bishop g5 to exchange off the knight on e7, and will probably have a very equal endgame or late middle game on his hands, so it looks quite equal. So that's d5 for you, quite safe. What's not so safe is a move like d6, trying to keep the material and still aiming for a short castle. Now rook c1 threatening the bishop, bishop a5, queen a4 threatening d5, winning a piece, which we will win here, and after bishop d7 the bishop on a5 drops. So this is actually losing. So taking with the knight on c3 is not recommended. It can give you a lot of trouble very early in the game. Bishop c3 is the better move, and after bc then d5 is the best move. You can't take this of course because there's a devilish check on e1 winning the knight by force, but d5 as usual, this is the safest way to play with black. And after a move like, for example, bishop a3, which is quite fun, just trying to stop castles. Very much in the spirit of the opening, but not good enough for an advantage, I'm afraid, because black can play this way, and after long castles, the black king will be super safe on c8 or b7 after b6. And I think actually it's black who has the attacking chances in this position, and black is a pawn up. So this is not recommended for white, but this variation can be a practical choice in blitz or rapid. So check this out. I'm not going to go into specifics on bishop c5 right now, because I think this pretty much covered what you need to know to play the Italian game in a practical game. And if you have any trouble in any of the lines, knight f6, bishop c5, I would recommend using the Lichess Opening Explorer, because there are lots of games, lots of variations in the Italian game. But I think this video will give you a decent overview over some of the key ideas for both players. So it's all about getting central control and getting your pieces out very early on. And of course, keeping the bishop pair with white is essential. So all of these ideas are covered in the video, and I'll see you in a later video, probably covering something else entirely. See you guys.